In the annals of modern warfare, victory is often calculated in terms of territory gained, enemy combatants neutralized, or industrial capacity dismantled. Yet in the crucible of the Second World War, a new and insidious theater of conflict emerged. A theater fought not with artillery shells or aerial bombardments, but with information, perception, and the fragile psychology of a nation at war. This was the war of the mind, a clandestine battlefield where the most potent weapon was not a piece of steel, but a piece of paper. It is here, in the shadowy realm of psychological operations, that we confront an enduring and unsettling tactical anomaly. Why did German soldiers, bound by oath to the Führer and fighting for the survival of the thousand-year Reich, become obsessive, almost desperate, readers of captured American mail? To grasp the profound tactical and psychological significance of this phenomenon, we must first understand the dystopian reality of the German information sphere in the waning years of the war. By late 1943, the citizens of the Third Reich existed within a suffocating echo chamber of propaganda, meticulously constructed by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. News from the front was a carefully curated weapon, designed to instill fanaticism and steel the population against the horrors of total war. Dissent was met with the iron fist of the Gestapo. Information was a ration commodity, and truth was the first casualty of the Nazi regime. This control extended to the written word, with every letter, every postcard, scrutinized for signs of defeatism or disloyalty. The Wehrmacht soldier, fighting on the Eastern Front or manning the defenses against the Allied invasion, was thus starved of objective reality, fed only a diet of triumph and heroic sacrifice. This starvation created a vacuum, a profound cognitive dissonance that the enemy, recognizing the fragility of human conviction, was poised to exploit. Enter the Allies, who understood that cracking the German military machine required more than just breaking its physical defenses. It required breaching the psychological fortress Goebbels had built. The United States Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, along with the British political warfare executive, began developing strategies to inject uncensored information directly into the bloodstream of the German populace. This was not merely a matter of distributing airdropped leaflets, which were often confiscated and destroyed before they could be read. It demanded a far more devious and elegant solution, a scheme to weaponize the very infrastructure of the Nazi state against itself. The result was one of history's most audacious psychological operations, Operation Cornflakes. The operation's premise was brilliantly simple yet monstrously complex. Since the German people distrusted official state radio and foreign broadcasts were a capital offense, the OSS reasoned that the one remaining trusted vehicle for information was the Daily Mail. If the Allies could somehow insert propaganda into the sanctity of the German postal system, they could bypass the censor's scissors and deliver their message directly to the family dining table. The plan hinged on the meticulous recreation of the entire German mail delivery process. To do this, OSS operatives recruited German prisoners of war who were former postal workers, offering them better rations in exchange for an exhaustive masterclass on the internal mechanics of the Reichspost, the specific colors of mailbags, the precise placement of cancellation stamps, the unique texture of postal stationery, and the exact bureaucratic codes used in transit. Armed with this intelligence, Allied forgers set to work. They established clandestine printing presses, employing typesetters and artists who could perfectly mimic the intricate swirls of German script and the distinctive typography of the era. They forged hundreds of thousands of envelopes, each addressed to carefully selected names culled from German telephone directories and, more darkly, from the death notices of soldiers killed in action. The goal was psychological saturation, to make the arrival of these enemy letters appear as routine as the morning newspaper. The postal deception was an act of extraordinary strategic penetration. After accurately addressing the mail, the OSS would manufacture counterfeit German mailbags, indistinguishable from the real article. These sacks were then loaded into specially modified bomb casings on Allied fighter bombers. When a targeted German mail train was attacked and derailed, the bombers would return, not to drop more high explosives, but to deposit these false mailbags into the wreckage. The predictable German obsession with order and efficiency would do the rest. Postal recovery teams, hurriedly clearing the debris, would collect the enemy's mailbags, assume them to be part of the original shipment, and dutifully deliver the letters to their intended recipients. It was a masterstroke of subterfuge, turning the enemy's own bureaucratic rigidity into the mechanism of its own undoing. The contents of these letters were strategic psychological warfare at its finest. The letters were not overtly treasonous, which would have immediately alerted the Gestapo. Instead, they were insidious. They contained gossip about non-existent people, rumors of food shortages and economic instability, and subtle hints of corruption among Nazi officials. They crafted a narrative of a nation suffering under a failed leadership. The most famous element of these mail drops was the forgery of the Reichspost stamps. The OSS created a death head stamp, which depicted Adolf Hitler's visage but with a subtle alteration. His face appeared partially replaced by a skull, and the state inscription Deutsches Reich, German Empire, was changed to Fuchs's Reich, ruined empire. When these letters arrived on a German breakfast table, they did more than just convey information. They sent a shiver of dread down the recipient's spine. They whispered a forbidden truth, that the Führer was a harbinger of death, leading his people to ruin. It was a psychological strike of the highest order. Yet, while Operation Cornflakes targeted the home front, a far more intimate and desperate form of psychological warfare was unfolding on the battlefields, where German soldiers were not just fighting the enemy, but reading him. This is where the enigma of the captured American mail finds its most profound and chilling expression. Facing the relentless pressure of the Allied advance, the Wehrmacht soldier began to notice a stark dichotomy between the narrative of impending victory fed to him by his commanders and the reality he observed on the field. American and British troops were well supplied, seemingly immune to the logistical nightmares that plagued the German army. They arrived with an overwhelming abundance of materiel, their trucks and tanks brimming with supplies, and even their individual infantrymen carried a staggering weight of equipment that seemed to mock the Spartan conditions of his German counterpart. It was in this context of material desperation that the captured mail became a source of invaluable and deeply demoralizing intelligence. When a German patrol overran an American position, the first instinct was to secure weapons and ammunition. But soon, a secondary, yet equally pressing, objective emerged: the capture of letters and personal effects. To the German soldier, these weren't just sentimental keepsakes destined for the trash. They were raw, unfiltered intelligence reports from the heart of the enemy's world. A letter home from a young GI named John from Ohio, describing the smooth operation of a factory he used to work at, was not just personal news. It was evidence of an industrial juggernaut that was completely unmolested by war. A letter from a mother to her son describing a new refrigerator she had just purchased was not a domestic anecdote. It was an indication of a civilian economy that was not only intact but thriving, a world away from the bombed-out, starving cities of Germany. These letters provided a shocking, visceral reality check. They spoke of a society where families were safe, where food was plentiful, and where the war was a distant, albeit tragic, necessity rather than an existential crisis. The contrast was devastating. German soldiers read of American teenagers driving their fathers' cars, attending high school dances, and dreaming of college, all while the Third Reich was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel, sending boys barely out of elementary school to the front lines. The psychological blow was immense. It didn't just reveal the Allies' material superiority, it exposed the lie at the very heart of the Nazi ideology. Hitler had told the German people they were members of a master race, destined to dominate the world. Yet, the captured American mail told a story of a nation of ordinary people living in comfort and freedom, a society that, from the perspective of the cold, hungry, and terrified German soldier, represented a vision of life that was deeply, painfully desirable. Perhaps even more potent than the letters from home were the captured letters from American soldiers to their wives and girlfriends. In an effort to maintain troop morale, the German High Command often disseminated propaganda suggesting that while their men were fighting and dying for the fatherland, their women back home were being seduced by foreign laborers or engaging in promiscuous behavior. This was a classic psychological ploy to generate jealousy and a fear of cuckoldry, thereby motivating men to fight harder to defend their women's honor. However, the captured American letters painted a starkly different picture. The OSS, in parallel with the intelligence gleaned from captured mail, had flooded the German army with its own forged letters, often supposedly from German women, implying their unfaithfulness. The American letters, however, provided a genuine, unvarnished counter-narrative. They spoke of longing, of faithfulness, and of a desperate desire for their men to return to a secure and happy home. This wasn't propaganda. It was the uninhibited outpourings of human emotion, and it cut through the Nazi lies like a razor. The German soldier who read these letters was faced with an impossible choice. He could either accept the official narrative that his people were a superior race fighting a noble war, or he could believe the evidence of his own eyes and the testimony of these unsolicited pieces of enemy mail. The letters became a portal to a world he could barely imagine, a world without the omnipresent threat of the Gestapo, the constant terror of bombing raids, and the gnawing certainty of eventual defeat. The captured mail wasn't just information. It was a revelation that broke down the carefully erected walls of hate and fear upon which the Nazi regime depended. This widespread reading of captured mail also served a secondary, and for the German command, highly dangerous tactical function. It fed a burgeoning black market of intelligence. Soldiers on leave or transferred to other units would share the captured letters with their comrades, spreading the unsettling news like a contagion. This oral transmission of information was entirely beyond the control of the military censors. Rumors of American wealth and German despair would spread through the ranks, corroding discipline and fostering a sense of fatalism. Soldiers began to ask themselves the most forbidden question of all: what are we fighting for? In contrast, the Axis prisoners of war held in the United States were experiencing the opposite phenomenon. Confined to camps across the American heartland, they were subjected to a form of psychological saturation that was the mirror image of Operation Cornflakes. Instead of reading about American prosperity, they were living in it. German and Italian POWs captured in North Africa or the European theater were transported to places like Camp Gordon, Georgia, or Camp Mexia, Texas. Here, they were fed plentifully, often better than the average German citizen could dream of, and were allowed to witness, albeit from behind barbed wire, the impossible productivity of the American war machine. They saw American farms producing surpluses, factories running at full tilt, and an economy that was untouched by the devastation that was consuming their own homeland. The contrast was so stark that it led to a profound cognitive crisis for many Axis prisoners. They were told they were prisoners of a degenerate, racially mixed nation that would collapse under the strain of war. Instead, they found themselves in a land of milk and honey. American military intelligence officers, recognizing the propaganda value of this exposure, actively encouraged it. They provided prisoners with access to American newspapers, often in foreign language editions, and allowed them to listen to local radio stations, thereby flooding them with news reports of Allied victories and, more importantly, advertisements for the consumer goods that were unavailable in the Third Reich. The prisoners' gripes, as observed by the International Red Cross, were not complaints of mistreatment, but rather the mundane grumblings of a soldier's life, a testament to the shockingly humane conditions they endured. This exposure created a generation of former combatants who, upon their return to a shattered Germany, could not help but be deeply affected by what they had witnessed, carrying back with them a narrative of American might and fairness that contradicted the official history of the Nazi state. The most profound and human consequence of this war of letters, however, lies in the stories of individual soldiers caught between the titanic forces of the conflict. One of the most extraordinary examples of this is the relationship between American Lieutenant Tony Unrein and German translator Hans Zemsch during the Battle of the Bulge. Unrein was captured and severely injured, and as a prisoner of war, he was at the mercy of a system designed to break him. Yet, in a series of events that defy the expected narrative of total war, he was saved by his enemy. Zemsch, a German soldier who had lived in San Francisco and spoke fluent English, was detailed to guard and translate for American prisoners at a hospital near Nuremberg. Instead of enforcing the brutal standard of the Nazi regime, Zemsch used his position to secure food and medical attention for the starving and wounded American POWs, putting his own life at risk to demonstrate a semblance of humanity. Years later, after the war, Unrein wrote a letter to Zemsch's daughter, detailing the profound debt he owed her father and expressing a yearning to maintain the connection that had formed in that hellish environment. He wrote, "I am still indebted to him for his untiring efforts to obtain food for all the men in the barracks for which he was responsible. He was a good man and cared for us as if we were brothers." This single letter, discovered decades later in a drawer, would bring two families together, bridging the chasm of war and hate. Unrein sent care packages of blue jeans and bicycles to Zemsch's family in Germany, while Zemsch reciprocated with sets of Bavarian porcelain. In the wreckage of the Nazi dream, these letters represented a lifeline of humanity. The act of reading, understanding, and responding to this mail became an act of defiance against the dehumanizing ideology of the regime. It is a testament to the enduring power of the written word to not only undermine an empire, but to build bridges between the most unyielding enemies. The psychological impact of this intelligence and these acts of humanity must be situated within the wider context of the Allied information campaign. Operation Cornflakes was the heavy artillery of this war of words, but the reading of captured mail was the infantry, engaging the enemy on a personal, psychological level. While Operation Cornflakes sought to plant seeds of doubt in the populace, the captured mail watered those seeds in the hearts of the combatants. The German soldier, starved of the truth and living in a fantasy of Nazi propaganda, found the truth in the most unreliable of places, the hands of the enemy. It is one of the great ironies of the conflict that the carefully manipulated speeches of Goebbels were often less convincing than a hastily written love letter from an American GI to his mother. The logisticians of psychological warfare recognized that a people's mail is a reflection of their soul. The Allies systematically harvested this information, not just for intelligence gathering, but for operational strategic planning. The breakdown in morale observed through the reading of captured mail was a tangible intelligence metric. When German soldiers, despite facing certain defeat, continued to fight with fanatical determination, it wasn't always because of their faith in Hitler. Often, it was because they feared the consequences of surrender more than death itself, a fear perpetuated by the lies they had been told about American brutality and Soviet atrocities. The captured mail, however, told a different story, one of fair treatment, of medical care, and of eventual repatriation to a rebuildable homeland. This sowed a dangerous seed of hope, a vision of a future after Hitler that was not the apocalyptic destruction promised by the Nazi leadership. This analysis of captured mail also exposed the fundamental weakness of the Axis powers in the realm of information warfare. While the Allies were forging stamps and building intricate propaganda networks, the German counterintelligence was, in many ways, reactive and cruder. German forgeries of British stamps, for example, often featured anti-Semitic caricatures, a message that resonated with the core tenets of Nazi ideology but lacked the nuanced subtlety of the OSS's operations. The Allies, by comparison, were running a sophisticated, data-driven campaign to undermine the enemy's belief system from the ground up. The Nazi propaganda machine was a hammer, while the Allied strategy was a scalpel, precise, invasive, and devastatingly effective. The legacy of this hidden war is etched not only in the history books, but in the fundamental understanding of modern psychological operations. The act of reading captured mail, a simple and desperate act of human curiosity, became a core component of intelligence gathering and psychological assault. It demonstrated that the most potent propaganda isn't the speech delivered from a balcony, but the authentic, unfiltered voice of the enemy's citizenry. In the endless echo chamber of the Third Reich, a single letter from an American farm boy in Ohio was an atomic bomb of truth. It spoke of a world without fear, a world of plenty, and a world where the war was not an ideology but a temporary and regrettable interruption to a life of peace. As the German forces crumbled in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945, the reading of captured mail took on a new, desperate urgency. It was no longer about gauging the enemy's material superiority, but about understanding the nature of the world that would emerge after the collapse. Soldiers who had spent years fighting against a monolithic, demonized image of the West were confronted with the reality that their enemies were not devils but ordinary people. This realization shattered the fanatical will to fight to the death that had characterized the Nazi resistance. It paved the way for massive surrenders, not just because the military situation was hopeless, but because the psychological barriers to surrender had been systematically dismantled by the truth contained in those letters. The question that remains, and that we must ask ourselves, is a deeply tactical and morally unsettling one. In the age of total war, where information is a fundamental weapon of destruction, where does the line between legitimate psychological warfare and psychological terrorism lie? The Allies in World War II broke the sanctity of the mail, a cornerstone of civil society, and weaponized it against an enemy that had discarded all notions of sanctity. They forged the love letters of German women, they mocked the face of the enemy's leader, and they manipulated the most intimate forms of human communication to further their strategic objectives. Was this a necessary evil to defeat a monstrous regime, or did it represent a dangerous descent into the abyss of total war, a war where no aspect of civilian life was off-limits? The German soldier, reading American mail, was not just a passive recipient of propaganda. He was a participant in a desperate act of self-preservation, seeking a truth that could save him from the flames of the Nazi apocalypse. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal was not the atom bomb, but the simple, devastating truth of human connection.